thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning for our session on the Unsuitable Accommodation Order. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Fiona McLeod. I'm a Senior Associate within Brodie's Government Regulation and Competition team, and I'm also an accredited specialist in housing and residential tenancy law. This morning I'm delighted to be joined by Callum Chomzuk, National Director of the Chartered Institute of Housing, Michael Cameron from the Scottish Housing Regulator, and Tony Cain from ALACHO. So just to set the scene for this morning's session, we're going to be having a discussion around the UAO and the impact this will or is likely to have on the sector. With that in mind, could everybody please use the chat function to pose any questions that you may have for the speakers, and this should help encourage the discussion around topics which you in particular will find relevant. Questions will remain anonymous, and we're happy to follow up with anyone that would like to discuss further after the session. Also, for your information, this webinar is being recorded. So to provide a little bit of context, as you'll be aware, the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Scotland Amendment Order 2020 was laid on the 5th of May 2020 and came into immediate effect. And this legislation included temporary exceptions to allow local authorities to use a certain type of temporary accommodation in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Those temporary extensions were due to expire on the 30th of September 2020. However, as you will all know, as the coronavirus pandemic continues, Scottish Government have extended the Coronavirus Scotland Act in response to the ongoing impact and the effects it's having on housing and the homelessness system. So they have extended the temporary exceptions to the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Order for at least a further 4 months. And that they have indicated that by extending the temporary exemptions of the 2020 UEO until the 31st of January 2021, this will allow local authorities to continue to use certain types of temporary accommodation to ensure that homeless households are allowed to access physical distance and self-isolate where this is required to the continuing coronavirus pandemic. In addition, the order will add a modification of the temporary exceptions to permit local authorities to place households in accommodation that will otherwise be deemed as unsuitable, where there is a lack of availability of suitable temporary accommodation or settled accommodation. And this is as a result of the indirect impacts of COVID-19 on accommodation supply in the area. The changes in legislation will affect local authorities and all people experiencing homelessness, and the amendment contributes to the following outcomes within the National Performance Framework, which are fundamental to the ambition to end homelessness in Scotland. So with that background, and I appreciate that you're not here to listen to what lawyers have to say around the legislative provisions and instead listen to the experts in the field to discuss the topic and implications for the sector. So we have 3 speakers here with us this morning. Each speaker is going to provide some insight into their views of the order, and thereafter we're going to open the session up to some questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Callum, who's going to kick things off for us this morning. Thanks, Callum.
Okay, thanks loads, Fiona, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. So I suppose firstly, starting off, extending the Unsuitable Accommodation Order is something I think the whole homelessness and housing sector agrees with in principle. It's absolutely right that we want to eliminate the use of unsuitable temporary accommodation for as many households as possible. That principle is absolutely accepted, and it's something that local authorities are doing already as part of the kind of approach when rapid rehousing plans, is we want to eliminate the use of unsuitable accommodation as wide as we possibly can. So we're all working towards that. And the kind of context you set out, Fiona, is important as well. Actually, we've delayed implementation of this to give local authorities more time. We've introduced a supply side exemption because of the kind of the crisis and the pandemic. So recognising that it is just ever harder to actually find appropriate accommodation. That's all appropriate. That's all reasonable. But when the final order is laid and comes into effect in January next year, we know there's going to be a significant increase in the number of breaches around this order. We know over the course of the pandemic we've had around 2,000 extra households in temporary accommodation, and we know, and Tony will probably talk a little bit more about the individual local authorities, but the kind of research that I've seen, that certainly Edinburgh Council as one made it public that they've got 1,000 properties, 25% of their temporary accommodation stock that will no longer be suitable once the final order comes into effect in January. Now, Edinburgh is perhaps an outlier in this, but that's a significant amount of properties that are suitable today that won't be suitable next year. We all want to get to the same point, but that's taking potentially a lot of stock out of the system, and we need to consider that. We had, just last week, we can talk about this a little bit more in discussion. With announcement last week from the Scottish Government on their what looks like an affordable housing supply budget. CIH, SFHA, and Shelter Scotland released a report earlier this summer looking about kind of social and affordable homes we need in Scotland. The next Parliament calling for at least 53,000. Ultimately, we can't eliminate homelessness on policies alone. We need supply to kind of match that. There's kind of two other points I'll mention as well. And I'm saying this is also we're creating a kind of more level playing field when it comes to unsuitable temporary accommodation. That's entirely understandable. However, what this does in turn is it eliminates the kind of positive discrimination that existed for kind of women, pregnant women in families with children. We already know we have a kind of lack of gendered analysis in homelessness housing policy in Scotland, so I think it's something to bear in mind. And I think as we've also introduced these new categories of appropriate accommodation, I think it's worth just considering at what point will perhaps pregnant women, families with children, parents who have guardianship responsibilities, if they are not necessarily the kind of primary carer, how much might they be unduly encouraged to kind of take up residency and shared accommodation, kind of community hosting, kind of and other accommodation that will kind of impact their ability to look after their children. So it's something to consider. And the last point I'll mention is this, and this isn't a change in the law, it hasn't changed at all, but with regards to kind of refuge provision in Scotland. So we have just under 500 refuge places across Scotland, and we know there's absolute huge pressure on them. I think only 1 in 6 applicants, homelessness applicants that come because of the consequence of domestic abuse, are able to get access into a refuge. Well, we know there's huge pressure, and that's why there is an exemption to the Unsuitable Accommodation Order with regard to refuge provision. There is a desire not to put any more undue pressure on that because capacity is such a problem. That, in a practical sense, makes sense. That absolutely, you can say we don't want to take away capacity, but fundamentally we are providing a lesser standard. If we're talking about want to improve access to high quality accommodation, the fact that we have this exemption in place for refugees suggests that we are allowing a lesser standard accommodation. I think that's as we're looking to perhaps equalise the kind of standards of housing people get across the sector, I think that's a difficult one to kind of marry up. Now that hasn't changed in this legislation as an existing clause, but I think it's something to consider. And I'll stop there, Fiona, and I'm going to pass to Tony for his reflections.
Thanks, Callum. So Tony is going to just give us a brief overview of really practical implications for local authorities and his views in relation to the UAO. Tony?
Yep, thank you very much. And obviously the first thing to do is echo much of what Callum has just said. The sector is in favour of this change, was very positive about the proposals that were made, had some concerns about the timing and some of the technical detail around it. But on balance, I think we all recognise that the right thing to do is improve the quality of temporary accommodation across the board. If we have to use it, it should be good quality. And particularly echo the points about women's refuge accommodation. It is right that an exemption is applied at this time, but the implication of that is we need to do some work to ensure that accommodation, that we support women's aid in particular, to bring that accommodation up to a standard where it doesn't need an exemption, but actually meets the wider objectives. I think just to start with then, an overview of where we are. I'm not going to focus down on individual local authorities, that would be a bit unfair and inappropriate, but looking across the sector, the last 6-10 months have been very difficult. There are probably 4 or 5 authorities, but only 4 or 5 authorities that are genuinely struggling, largely because of either the unique geography or the unique housing market conditions that they operate in, to consistently meet the temporary accommodation, the Unsuitable Accommodation Order, and avoid breaches. And that's not going to change in the short term. But I get your opener is most local authorities are preparing well and will manage their way through the implementation of these changes without huge difficulties. There will be a small number where the challenge is much greater because of local circumstances. I think, and that's, that'll be a challenge for the regulator. It'll be a challenge for those authorities as well, to set out effective plans to move themselves on and move themselves through those challenges. I think looking at the detail, though, of the changes that are being made, the first point to make is that the original order effectively protected expectant mothers and largely, not universally, but mostly women with dependent children. That was the focus of the principal order, to ensure that they were never placed in basically shared accommodation or bed and breakfast accommodation for any significant length of time. There's a much bigger challenge than I think it initially appeared in widening that out to everybody, and an early recognition that we would probably need to have a more sophisticated definition of what the different types of temporary accommodation and which households or which types of households might be suitable for which, and introducing those different types. So we now have community hosting, shared accommodation, and the other one, groups of three always beat me. Remind me, somebody, what the third one is that I can't remember at the moment, which are new to the system. I think the one with the biggest risk is around shared accommodation. The order also allows local authorities to, in some circumstances, to place clients outside their own local authority area. So whereas that would pretty much always have been regarded as unsuitable, it's now not necessarily so. And the challenge that opens up for local authorities is how they understand the degree of choice that they're offering to particularly more vulnerable applicants who they're looking to place in shared accommodation with strangers, because that's probably the biggest area of risk, if you like, to individuals as a consequence of this. So how you understand choice and how you articulate and exercise that choice. So it's all very well saying if you don't fancy shared accommodation, you don't have to take it. But if you don't have anything else, then you're not really offering a choice. And that's really one of the critical areas that's going to be most challenging in the middle of all that. But actually, I think particularly when it comes to community hosting and shared accommodation, properly understanding the risks and vulnerabilities of individuals, recognizing that they may not always express their concerns fully, and there may be risks and vulnerabilities in there that the authority isn't aware of, and then being sensitive to those in the way in which they provide temporary accommodation. It isn't always going to be easy. We are going to start the process with a significant number of breaches. They're likely to be concentrated on a small number of authorities, and those authorities have a significant challenge in unpicking that. Edinburgh, I think, just to comment on a paper because it was public, recently discussed this at one of their committees. They were looking at 11 years in order to work their way through to meeting the full ambition set out in their rapid rehousing transition plan, including those around temporary accommodation. So it's a huge challenge. It's the right challenge, but it is unquestionably a huge challenge. I think what it demands of homelessness authorities, of local authorities, is an even stronger focus on understanding the particular needs and vulnerabilities and concerns of individuals and talking to them honestly and properly about choice and options that they have available to them and how they manage those and what the issues and risks are around that. That will do for me.
Thanks, Tony. And Michael is now just going to have a quick introductory chat through the regulatory perspective. So, Michael, over to you.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, everyone. So on Wednesday, we published a restated corporate plan to take account of the impact of the pandemic on our work and activities. And some things have changed, but within that, we've maintained a very clear focus on homelessness. It's very much a prominent feature of that corporate plan. So we'll maintain a particular focus on compliance with statutory duties around homelessness. Having said that, we have already stated that we'll take account of the pandemic on landlords' ability to comply with requirements, and where they're unable to comply, we would be looking at how they plan to address that. I think it's probably also worth putting today's discussion in context with a look at how things currently are for people who are homeless and for councils working to help them. So from our monthly dashboards, we see that the number of people who applied to local authorities as homelessness in August actually fell by a relatively small amount of 2% on the figure in July. But but it looks like things are starting to get back to the kind of levels that you would have expected to see had the world been fairly normal. But while there was that small drop in applications, there's been a further increase in the number of households in temporary accommodation. And we've now got over 14,300 households in temporary accommodation at the end of August. And that compares to round about 11,500 when all of this started back in March, April. Alongside that, at the end of August, we also had roughly about 9,500 homes sitting empty. And that again was an increase on the previous month. So that's in the context of landlords actually having let more homes during August, up by about 600 on the figure in July. And round about 1,600 of those lets went to people who had been homeless. So you can see the scale of the task to provide suitable temporary and permanent accommodation is significant. And I think we are certainly very conscious that the requirements around unsuitable accommodation have been changing rapidly over the last 6 months or so, the latest order coming into effect on Wednesday, and that, as has already been touched on, extended the coronavirus exceptions to 31st of January. It also introduced that new temporary exception around being able to place households in unsuitable accommodation where the supply of temporary accommodation in an area is adversely impacted on by coronavirus. I think that one does beg a number of questions. It's fairly loosely defined. And one of the things which certainly might be a subject of discussion for us at the regulator would be how do you determine that sufficient efforts have been made to secure an adequate supply of suitable accommodation. I think it's worth reflecting on the Scottish Government's messaging and guidance that's already out there around unsuitable accommodation, as I think that helps to set expectations. So referencing back to the Minister's letter to landlords in May, the Minister acknowledged that full compliance by the target date of May 21 may not be possible, but what he's looking for is progress. He wants to see significant and steady reductions in the use of B&Bs and robust plans as part of RRTPs to work towards full compliance. So this suggests there will be some tolerance for levels of non-compliance, and that the expectation is around a direction of travel rather than absolute compliance from the outset. The Scottish Government plans to issue guidance soon, both on reporting of breaches and more generally around how landlords can meet their duties around temporary accommodation. Along with councils, we'll take a bit of time to digest that guidance to ensure our regulatory position reflects what it sets out. So while there's still a few uncertainties at the moment, I think given what we know already, it strikes me that councils will want to ensure that they have a robust assessment of the level of need for suitable accommodation now and into the future. A clear plan to deliver that, and so to get to full compliance with the Unsuitable Accommodation Order, and there's an obvious link in that into the RRTPs, and then to have effective monitoring to allow them to demonstrate the level of compliance they have, but also then to show the progress that they're achieving, and how that relates to the plans that they have set out. So clearly, I think it's going to be critically important the landlords are able to accurately and fully record the circumstances of each placement in temporary accommodation. I think that's going to be an important building blocks to enable them to demonstrate compliance or progress towards compliance. I'll finish by just saying that while the Unsuitable Accommodation Order is going to be an important part of our monitoring over the coming period, we will continue to monitor wider performance on homelessness by both councils and RSLs.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. I don't know about those that are listening on the call, but certainly it's prompted a few questions from me. But please feel free to put your questions into the chat function so that we can address them during this call. But I'll kick off just with a question, and it's a couple of things that you had touched upon, Michael. And one of the things that I'm interested in is you mentioned about this, the guidance that will be being produced. And my understanding is that the Local Authority Working Group, which was set up in May 2020, have been developing some guidance. And this is going to assist local authorities in their interpretation of the order. Whilst I know that a lot of this will be sensitive information and that not very much will be able to be released, could you provide the group, perhaps Tony and maybe Michael, on some insight in relation to the guidance, when you think it will be released, and also with the consideration that a third statutory instrument is going to be produced and what that will encompass and how that will change the legislation as it currently stands? Tony, do you want to start? You're on mute.
There you go. My apologies. I thought my microphone was being controlled centrally. There you go. Yeah, I mean, I was just actually looking at the guidance there just very, very quickly. I think one of our difficulties is that we've been through a rather more complicated process with this change to the order than we might otherwise have done, and it has included the initial change, a second set of changes, and now a final set of changes. And the guidance that is in the process of being drafted is based around the final set of changes, which are not currently in force. However, I think the more difficult areas have been around the definition of the three new types of accommodation, and then the articulation of concerns and risks that arise around that. So we have, as we know, I can only remember two of the three new types of temporary accommodation: community hosting, shared accommodation, and the other one. Can somebody help me out here, guys? Why can't I remember what this other one is?
Rapid access accommodation.
There you go. Rapid access accommodation. And rapid access accommodation in particular is, and around that goes the concerns about moving away from dormitory type rapid access accommodation to rapid access accommodation, which offers a degree more security and privacy than has traditionally been the case with night shelters. And we have a clear intention to eliminate the use of night shelters in the near future. But there are some definitional risks. So what does community hosting look like? We know, for example, that some of the models of community hosting don't permit 24/7 access. So the expectation is you would stay overnight, or the individual would stay overnight, be out of the accommodation during the day, and then back in again the following night if that's part of the, if that's the way it's been set up. Now, you know, not having 24/7 access is a definition of unsuitable accommodation in other areas. So the trick has been both writing the order and writing the guidance in a way which allows the use of these types of models where appropriate and in the right way, but also acknowledges that the client group that they're appropriate for is very, very specific. And in amongst all that, articulating some of the risks, but also being clear about how choice is to be understood on the part of clients and how choice is to be operated has been one of the technical challenges. The guidance will not be perfect when it's issued, there's no question about that, and there'll probably have to be a further process as it is properly integrated into the full set of statutory guidance under the whole homelessness guidance document, which this is not at the moment intended to be. There's an incorporation process later on. But it hasn't been an easy process. It is genuinely very unfortunate that we're sitting here now without either the final order or the current draft of the guidance being more widely available. And I think that's a conversation that we're going to need to have with colleagues in the Scottish Government fairly soon. and maybe even something I'll be taking up with them next week. We need to get some clarity about these issues, and we need folk to get a chance to think about them in advance. But I suppose the big risks arise around equalities issues. And to be clear, I know Shelter challenged the recent version of the order and attempted to encourage parliamentarians to block it. I think because they are concerned mostly about the breadth of the current CV coronavirus exemption. If you can make the case that the market is substantially damaged, then you almost don't have to worry too much about the wording of the order at all. That will not be the reaction in local government. I know that won't be the reaction in local government, but you can understand why Shelter are worried. So I think one of the priorities at the moment is to get a version of the guidance out and available to the sector and get a further round of conversation with. I'm not an expert. The experts are out there delivering services and making these decisions, and we need to get that view into the process as quickly as we can.
And if we get any suggested dates or any indicative dates for any of this to be released?
Not that I'm aware. And I know one of the areas of part of the process has been the political process. It's been about taking it to COSLA, which is the right way that these things should be done. COSLA getting a chance to consider the details of it and to have that discussed by the Community and Wellbeing Board, which is the spokespeople from across the local government. And at the back of that for housing convenience to also get a look. Now that's been completed, so that process has been worked through, and I'm hopeful that we'll be in a position to publish some form of guidance over the next couple of weeks.
Okay, great, thank you. And Michael, do you have anything you want to add on in relation to that?
No. Perhaps just to say around timescale, I'm aware that Scottish Government will be looking to get stakeholder views towards the end of October, which suggests that we're not going to see this probably before we get into November. So 1 to 2 months timescale looks reasonable at this point.
Okay, great. And we've got a question here from our audience saying that the impacts of COVID include financial impacts. Do the panelists have a view on how meeting the challenges of these impacts will play out alongside the requirements of the order, which are likely to incur additional expense? And I know that when we've been talking about having this session this morning, we had chatted a little bit about the recent announcement from Scottish Government in relation to their budget for affordable supply. And so this is quite a hot topic. So who wants to start with this one? Callum, do you want to kick off?
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I mentioned in my kind of remarks, I think the sector is, Tony said as well, the sector is positive about its trajectory. The approach to kind of rapid rehousing is embedded in that anyway. We want to see the kind of elimination of unsuitable temporary accommodation for everyone, but policy changes will not enact this on its own. I mean, you can change processes and procedures to a degree and you can improve housing, but fundamentally where you do need a kind of appropriate supply available, whether that's within the social sector, whether it's utilising the private rented sector or elsewhere, that we do need appropriate supply. And I think the indicative budget that was identified in the infrastructure investment plan suggested a kind of capital allocation is 2.8 billion for the next affordable housing programme. There are additional top-ups that can be allocated to that. I think any ambition, and Tony mentioned Edinburgh City Council will take 11 years in the current trajectory to actually eliminate unsuitable temporary accommodation. That's 11 years is a lifetime. It's an absolute enormous amount that you can't. We're talking 5-year budget cycles. With 11, we're going beyond 2 cycles for that. If we're actually serious about eliminating the use of temporary accommodation and appropriate temporary accommodation all across Scotland, then there has to be a realistic allocation of grant from the Scottish Government. I don't believe there's much more that social landlords can do to draw money from tenants and tenants' rent to pay for a kind of an appropriate building programme. I do believe needs to be a detailed conversation around the kind of grant rate and overall funding envelope for the supply. I recognise, I think we're all kind of, every sector in Scotland is making a case for why they need that. It's absolutely understandable, and it's not to underplay the kind of the real needs that exist in other sectors. But we have made some progress in the last 4.5 years or so in Scotland in improving access to supply. It would be an absolute dereliction of duty to go back on that. That's a political decision, and I think everybody involved in the housing sector involved in it politically now will make those representations. But yeah, they're huge financial challenges, but it's up to organisations like CIH and others to actually make that representation, and to actually the government needs to, and the government as opposed to tenants needs to invest what we need for appropriate supply.
Thanks, Callum. Tony, do you want to just provide us with your thoughts in relation to this?
Yeah, I mean, I see there's a question in the chat there about the connection between this and the changes to local connection as well, which I'm happy to pick up if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think every part of the public service is facing additional costs as a consequence of COVID, and we do need to be a little bit careful about getting involved in special pleading around our particular situation. Operating all these services is costing more, and it includes a number of additional risks and concerns that need to be managed, but we're not in a different position from any other part of the public service. There's a conversation that needs to go on with colleagues in government about how that's being funded and supported. I don't think it bears on the principal objective here of improving outcomes for homeless folk, and even around the issues on supply. The pressing need is to have fewer folk presenting as homeless. The prevention agenda needs to be developed. On some of the systemic drivers of homelessness needs to be addressed. The biggest single cohort are women fleeing or escaping domestic violence, domestic abuse. We absolutely have to do something about that process, which means they don't end up going through the homelessness process, that you don't add the trauma of homelessness to all the other traumas those individuals and their families are already facing. That's 19% or something of the total number of people that are presenting as homeless. Taking those out of the framework, finding a better way of meeting their particular needs will have a significant impact on both their experience and the overall pressures on the system. And the other one is it's absolutely right to focus on rapid rehousing, so folk that do go into temp are moved on as quickly as possible. Callum's point about supply is critical on that. We do not have the supply of settled accommodation that we need, and we need to look at increasing that. Hopefully in the next 5 years we'll have another healthy investment programme, and we'll see further progress. Just to turn to, if I may briefly, the local connection issue. I suppose we need to see this in its history. I was watching a programme the other day about the preparations. This may seem a little bit obscure, bear with me. Preparations for handling refugees after the Blitz in the UK starting in 41. And there was an argument about how you would operate rest centres and how you would manage the distribution of blankets, bearing in mind that some of those in the rest centre may not have come from the local authority area where the rest centre was located. And that argument actually obstructed the process of ensuring that rest centres were managed effectively, blankets and other forms of aid were distributed properly, and the whole process degenerated and resulted in the death of 60 or 70 people in a rest centre that was bombed because it hadn't been managed properly and it hadn't been cleared. The people were left there waiting to get bombed the following night, and they duly were. So that's an extreme example of it, but it does rather suggest that obsessing about where folk come from before you help them is probably not the correct order of business. And the objective is to find the level of assistance that meets their needs first, and then fret about where they've come from. That may sound like a slightly glib answer, but it is just one that sets it in a bit of historical context. This isn't 1832. We're not branding folk for leaving their parish and going somewhere else. We're focusing on meeting the needs of individuals. There will be other complications in local connection, and particularly, just to throw a bit of a curveball into the conversation, how you manage the high-risk offenders in the context of them having absolutely free choice of where they stay geographically is an interesting one. The process around prison liberation, for example, at the moment it starts with, do you have somewhere to go for those people who are likely to be homeless? Now it has to start with, which local authority area would you like to apply to if they don't have anywhere to go? And that in itself is a big change to the process and how you might conceive of managing the liberation process and the homelessness that often results from that. But it also means that you may have to offer that same level of choice to managed offenders, and I think that's could be quite challenging. So, but getting back to the original question, which of course I'm now struggling to remember, Financial impacts are there and they're there for everybody to deal with. We need to be clear about what they are. We need to articulate them properly and have a conversation with government. What we don't need to do is imagine that we're in any sense unique in facing those challenges.
And Callum, I think you wanted to come back in just on this.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. So I wanted to pick up the point Tony made around the drivers of women's homelessness and domestic abuse. So I don't know how much people on the webinar are aware, but on Monday we're expecting the Scottish Government to launch, I think it's the right terminology, of their kind of legislation looking at emergency protective orders, emergency barring orders. So that will allow the temporary removal of a kind of perpetrator of domestic abuse from a domestic setting, and that will apply at all tenures, and that'll kind of remove a risk to kind of women experience domestic abuse, and that's something that's long been welcomed. Encouragingly, alongside that, and we'll wait to see, but our understanding is that the legislation will also include clauses that will allow for the transfer of tenancy within the social rented sector. So and we have to work out what the triggers for this are, but the principle being that a victim of domestic abuse will, as Tony was rightly pointing out, will no longer have this presumption that a victim, and usually her and her children, have to leave their own home, their own locality, the kind of place where they have made their home. But now landlords will be able to transfer the perpetrator out and then transfer the tenancy into the victim's name. Now, this obviously has to go through a parliamentary process, but when Tony talks about addressing some of the kind of drivers, systemic problems that kind of create homelessness, this is what this legislation. So I was perhaps being a little bit flippant earlier. You can't do this in policy alone. It needs supply, and for the most part, I'll stand by that. But there are policy changes that can make a difference, and I think the legislation that's coming forward on Monday is a really positive step. Because Parliament's ending in March, we will see this legislation, as long as it's not amended down, I wouldn't expect it to be so, will be on statute books by early next year. And that's a really positive step. It's not enough. It's by no means enough. People know we've been doing a campaign for a number of years now on domestic abuse in social housing called Make a Stand, and our experience is that despite a lot of buy-in, there still isn't enough actual change in practice and policy from landlords around adopting a domestic abuse policy and changing their practice. There are definitely good examples, but it's still not whole scale across the sector. I hope pieces of legislation like this will provide a further catalyst, but I think the reality is there may be more compulsion required around what we expect and how we expect landlords to kind of address this part of preventing homelessness.
And I think, Callum, just following that through, and in relation to the emergency barring orders, and then say perhaps that it follows through to the transfer of tenancy into the victim's name, which we've been working on quite closely, and I very much welcome that these proposals are going to be laid before Parliament. But what then happens in terms of looking at it from the local authorities' perspective or RSL's perspective, when they are then transferring the tenancy and the perpetrator, would they then present themselves as homeless? Is that the intention, or is it that they then get placed into another accommodation, and does that then put further pressures on the sector? Now, you know that I'm very much pro this change in legislation, but just playing devil's advocate and looking at how that then could that create then further pressures? So
we're not, the intention of this is you're not creating additional homelessness, and that would be a mess of the system. Actually, we're not trying to just kind of substitute one homelessness. The idea, the concept behind it, and we'll see how the kind of practice comes along, but that we will move the perpetrator into other appropriate accommodation. I think what we've talked about earlier is around some of the concerns around moving women and children in certain types of accommodation, which are not as, perhaps some of those concerns aren't as present for an individual man, and that we potentially find that easier to reallocate a home to a man. There are a number of things to consider in that, but ultimately we are not. The intent of this policy is not just to create homelessness for the perpetrator, it's to give the victim the opportunity to stay in her home with her children, if that's the case, and find an appropriate accommodation somewhere for the perpetrator elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we need to just to put that in context. The perpetrator moves has to mean the perpetrator moves in a managed way to settled accommodation where they can reasonably stay. Creating a situation where you have an individual roaming the streets, angry and resentful, isn't a way of protecting people who are suffering the effects of domestic abuse. So to that extent, it may seem uncomfortable. The reward is a move to another home, but actually that is necessary, both in human rights terms, because there is a human right to housing, but also from the perspective of the individuals we're looking to protect here. You don't protect them by forcing their partners or former partners or their abusers into homelessness. And to the extent that that's a little bit difficult, it's just necessarily the approach that we have to take.
Yeah, and Michael, just turning back to, because I'm conscious of time, so turning back to the kind of regulatory perspective with the UAOs, I appreciate we've deviated slightly into some other realms, as we always tend to do in these conversations, but when we're looking at that, and we'd mentioned that record keeping is so important, so that you can show compliance where possible, and appreciate that the comments from the Housing Minister that full compliance by May next year is unlikely to be achievable, but we're looking at in a downward trend, as you'd said, of using temporary unsuitable accommodation. So what kind of things, practical terms, what kind of things would you be looking for as a regulator then from local authorities to satisfy compliance with this?
Well, I mean, satisfying compliance would be that they demonstrate that they don't use unsuitable accommodation. But in the context of the Minister's statements and the expectations that are likely to come out from Scottish Government, I think it would be about showing that there's a clear plan that takes the landlord to a place where they don't have to use unsuitable accommodation, that there's clear milestones associated with that plan, and that the landlord is then able to demonstrate progress through that plan and achievement of the relevant milestones. That's a very similar process to the process that's been mapped out for rapid rehousing transition plans. So it fits with that type of way of working. What I think we want to understand more from the Scottish Government and from the guidance when it comes out is what is in their minds around overall timescales for that. So, rapid rehousing transition plans, we had a 5-year horizon for delivery. What's the horizon for delivery on achieving full compliance with the Unsuitable Accommodation Order?
And Tony, practically, how achievable is this then for local authorities?
It is achievable, but we're operating in amongst a huge range of other challenges. I mean, kind of the one thing I think Michael and I will absolutely agree on is that pleasing the regulator is an outcome. It's not an objective. Get it right, meet your obligations, deliver high quality services and high quality outcomes, and the regulator will acknowledge that as exactly what you should be doing. It's a consequence, not the thing that you aim at. This will take some time. We have some huge challenges, both within the system itself and the extent to which it generates homelessness, but also in the way in which we've been managing and delivering temporary accommodation, and some of the challenges that the client groups within that are facing. Now, much has been made of, we ended rough sleeping overnight back in March. Well, I'm not persuaded by that, but we also know that 8 of those rough sleepers died in a single hotel over the period since then, as a consequence of other challenges which were not properly addressed, and other assistance that they didn't necessarily get, particularly around drugs, mental health and alcohol issues. So this isn't just a matter of chucking houses at people. It's not just a matter of coming up with somewhere a roof over somebody's head. And we have some quite tough conversations to go on around health services in particular, health and support services, mental health and drug and alcohol services, and how we ensure that those services are being delivered in the right way to meet the needs of these client groups. And there's a whole different conversation, different from the one we're currently having, that needs to take place with our colleagues in health. And by that, I mean clinical elements of health, not public health, who talk to us all the time. The folk delivering the services are less easy to talk to. And we need to get that right, because we're not getting it right. So it's not just about what does the accommodation itself look like, but what else is being done to assist those individuals once you've got them off the streets or once you've got them into a relatively settled environment, and how quickly can you then support them either through Housing First or some other route into settled and properly supported accommodation in the long term. It's, I mean, to look back at some of the core statistics, about 70% of everybody that presents as homeless gets a house, goes away and never comes back. We need to move more of those individuals to a place where they don't need assistance to find a home, that they can find a home in the system under their own speed. And that 30% of people that present, we need to move more of those into the one and done category so that we get an outcome which is sustainable first time round, and we actively respond to that group of individuals who, once they present a second time, are genuinely at risk of a downward spiral into a very, very difficult and protracted engagement with homelessness and a whole number of other challenges that will have a significant impact on their well-being and their life chances and those of their dependents and those around them. So it's a much bigger challenge than just have we got enough temporary accommodation, is it the right sort? And what happens in temporary accommodation is a critical part.
And just touching on what Michael had said, and I know there's a question from our attendees, which I will come on to because it's kind of moving back towards domestic abuse, but just to round this off, because I'm conscious of time, and Michael, you had just talked a little bit about the number of empty households that we have within Scotland at the moment in the social housing sector. And really, I suppose that my question in relation to this is, everything is very much up in the air at the moment, and we had timed this webinar to really be around the time when we would have some guidance, so we'd be able to be a little bit more concrete, but unfortunately there's been a delay in relation to that. But what can local authorities be doing now? What preparations should they be making? What should we be looking at in terms of collaborative working with RSLs and ensuring settled accommodation? Are there things that can the ball be started to be rolling with the view that by kind of middle next year we're going to be looking for compliance in relation to the UAO?
Well, I think a lot of that work is probably going on as we speak, and has that type of collaboration between local authorities and RSLs is not new. That's been going on for a considerable amount of time, and local authorities, rely on RSLs to do a number of things. One, to be active in the prevention of homelessness. Two, to assist them in providing suitable temporary accommodation. And there's been a significant increase in the number of properties that have been let by RSLs to local authorities for that purpose over the last 6 months. So there's maybe, maybe we've crossed a line in some way where that's now a much more accepted part of what that collaboration needs to deliver. And then settled accommodation and having the right levels of property becoming available to local authorities from RSLs to enable them to discharge their statutory duties effectively and quickly. And I think there's the question of supply of suitable temporary accommodation is one which I think we need to think about, both in terms of the absolute level of supply, but also the most efficient use of the supply we currently have. So we are still in a place where a lot of households sit in temporary accommodation, which will be suitable, but they sit in it for a lengthy period of time before they're moved on to settled accommodation. You move people through that much more quickly, as is the intention of rapid rehousing, then that available suitable accommodation it becomes much more efficiently used and can help to address the reality of a lot of people currently sitting in unsuitable accommodation. So there's an efficiency aspect to this, as well as that absolute question of supply.
Does anyone else have any comments on that before we move on to another question?
Yeah, I mean, if you give me a huge range of challenges in around all this, and a big debate about whether or not where we are is quite the right place to be. The supply issue will not solve itself. I mean, in the short term, we have 9,000 council and housing association properties lying empty and unusable because they haven't been fixed and brought back into use. That has to be a priority for every social landlord in Scotland. And we need to be clear that that was a priority whether we're in a local lockdown or not, whether or not there are COVID restrictions or not. I think what we've learned since March is that the process of assisting vulnerable people into settled accommodation isn't an optional extra, and it is something that should be sustained through every lockdown as best as we possibly can. It's an essential service in exactly the same way as we have seen other essential services operating, because the alternative is what we are starting to see, which is thousands of additional individuals sitting long-term in temporary accommodation. And for all the 3,000 or so that have come into that temp in the last few months, there were, as Michael has already pointed out, 11,500 households already in temp back in March, many of whom are still there. And that has to be something that we regard as unacceptable. But there's no underestimating the scale of the challenge here. Our housing system doesn't operate as effectively or as fairly as it could, and this is addressing an inequality in that system. But it's a systemic inequality. It's not one that you pathologize. It's not the fault of homeless people that they find themselves where they are. That our system generates homelessness, and we need to address that as in parallel with a process of better supporting and equipping folk to manage their journeys through their housing journeys.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions, and I don't think we're going to be able to touch on them all, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. And those that we haven't been able to answer your questions, please contact me directly after the webinar finishes, and we'll be able to come back to you on them. But one question that we had touched on when we originally talked about holding this webinar around the anticipated surge in possible challenges to local authorities as a result of breaching the UAO, where locally supply of suitable accommodation simply doesn't exist, and there's essentially impossibility of performance and compliance. And I'll probably touch a little bit on this because it's something that really I raised with the panelists in relation to enforcement, because as it stands, the legislative provisions don't say anything about enforcement in the event of a breach. You know, the regulator can step in and take the steps that they can do, but it doesn't actually give any immediate result to those that are looking to be placed. And I suppose my anticipation is that it would really be, it's very expensive on the one hand to raise a judicial review in the Court of Session in relation to a decision that's been taken by the local authority, and there are a number of tests that have to be satisfied, and one of those tests has to be around fairness and proportionality and reasonableness of the decision that's been made by the local authority. So should there be a challenge in relation to the decision of a local authority by judicial review where there's been a breach of the Unsuitable Accommodation Order, then you'd be looking at, well, what was the decision-making process that was undertaken by the local authority? You would take into consideration the availability that the local authority have, because as we've heard today, you know, supply is always going to be an issue, and that's not something that can be solved overnight. And you would really, there's quite a high bar for those that would be raising the challenge to meet, should that be a successful challenge in the Court of Session as a result of the decision that's been made by the local authority. Where I anticipate that these may come is it's likely to come from charitable organisations such as Shelter, who may be doing some form of group proceedings in the event that there was a number of people that hadn't been placed appropriately by a local authority and therefore were in breach of the UAO. I also think that it's one of those situations where it will be one case that will be a test case to ascertain how far that goes, and then further cases may follow if that was to be successful. But I think our position when we've all had a chat about it, and we've certainly had a chat about it in-house at Brodie's, is that it is quite a high bar for that person to meet, and it would be an individual that would require to take that challenge to the Court of Session, and the likelihood of that may be unlikely. However, litigators are always concerned to give such definitive answers in relation to this, because you just never know what's going to crop up on your desk tomorrow. But that would be certainly my view in relation to judicial reviews. It's a certain possibility, but quite a high test for that person raising the challenge to meet. And I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to touch on with that.
I'm absolutely not about to attempt to embellish a solicitor's view on a legal question. But this at the local level, this is a practical question. There are competing demands on the limited resources that local authorities have, and local authorities are making judgments around how they distribute those resources to deliver across a whole range of services. Homelessness services are competing with social care services, are competing with education services for revenue money to run and improve those services, and that's just the reality of it. And I don't think it's in any way easy to say you should spend less on looking after older people or people with learning disabilities and more on looking after people who are coming through the door and homeless. And that's effectively the choice that local authorities are genuinely having to make. I should declare an interest. I'm actively involved with Shelter as a member of their Scotland committee, so I'm slightly compromised on this, but strangely not. It's their job, it's their purpose to challenge outcomes in this system in the interests of individuals who come to them for assistance, and that's part of the process that has driven improvement in homelessness services over the last 40 years, 45 years since the 77 Act was introduced. I always took the view when I sat at my desk as a head of housing that you need to be sanguine about it. They're doing their job. If I made a mistake, I'm going to get caught out on it, and that's just how it goes, and I need to fix that. Rather than get oppositional about it, it was frustrating. It's always, particularly when you get folk threatening judicial review at the drop of a hat. But that isn't the habit, and it isn't in any event deliverable with that sense. And I think we need to acknowledge and accept and respect the roles that campaigning organisations play, and then focus down on our task, which is improving outcomes for this client group, albeit within the limits of the resources available to us. Mm-hmm. A direction, one of the interesting things about working in housing, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, is the direction of travel has been almost universally positive. We are in a much, much better place on homelessness than we were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. There are huge challenges, and we're still not doing as well as I would want us to do. But we do need to acknowledge that across the piece, we are getting better, albeit there are still some particular client groups who are very, very poorly served, and where the improvement is, rapid improvement, significant improvement is still required.
Yeah, and one other thing just to touch on that I should have mentioned is just to make sure that local authorities are ensuring their compliance with public sector equality duty, and we did touch upon the equalities aspects of this, and I appreciate that we're tight for time and can't go into it in too much detail, but certainly can discuss with anybody after this event in relation to that. But where we're really seeing big challenges in relation to judicial review of decisions of local authorities is around failure to comply with public sector equality duty, failure to undertake equality impact assessments. So as has been touched on in this session, and Michael had said, real importance in record keeping, making sure that any decision making process has the public sector equality duty fully in mind, and records in relation to that, because that may be where a successful challenge may ultimately actually come. So we're 2 minutes before we need to end, and I have one final question. I'm really sorry that we've not managed to get through all the questions that have been posed to us today, and certainly we will come back to you on those that we've been unable to answer. But my final question is a loaded question. Is the UAO the silver bullet to eradicate homelessness in Scotland? Who's first? Callum, you go first.
No. No, I think you need I think in Scotland, this is not in any way exclusive to housing and homelessness, but in Scotland I think we're all quite proud of the kind of the policy prescriptions that we put in place over the last 21 years. I think the Scottish Parliament's been a really positive vehicle for progressive policy, but it doesn't match on its own. We're having this really interesting debate on incorporating human rights law into Scottish law. That's a really interesting, and I think a positive debate. But back to that point, actually, the other question around things are enforcement. Unless there's budget, unless there's an enforcement mechanisms, then it doesn't really stand up. And Tony's point earlier around local authorities got to make decisions, and they do. So the policy in itself doesn't change anything. What we need to see is budgetary ability to deliver on the policy intention, and without that, we will not realise the ambition of the UAO and the change of the UAO as quickly as we'd like to. I'm not saying we won't get there, but in itself it doesn't change anything. It has to be matched by resources, and that's the struggle that local authorities will have in kind of adopting and amending them.
Yeah, obviously my answer is going to be absolutely the same for slightly different reasons. The answer is no, it's not a silver bullet. But that's because homelessness isn't primary. Homelessness in its most extreme forms, and homelessness of the most vulnerable individuals, isn't driven by the housing system. It's driven by health failures. we have a significant number of individuals and other failures as well who struggle to sustain any kind of tenancy because of their challenges with drugs and alcohol and mental health issues, and because of their engagement for a variety of reasons in the criminal justice system. And until you address those questions, you aren't going to end homelessness. Housing First, I think, would be better recast as a health intervention, and if you saw it as a health intervention, I suspect we would start to see different types of outcomes and improvements. And that's where our major failing lies, and we've yet to persuade our colleagues in the health service that their contribution to this is probably as equally important as the housing contribution. And
Michael, we'll finish with you.
Yeah, all of the above, I think, is the succinct answer. I think it's an important development. It's the right thing to do, as has been said all along, but it's certainly not a silver bullet. The silver bullet, I think, is a very complex one, but it's principally about there being the ambition to achieve that outcome.
Great, and on a consensus, we'll end it there. And I would just like to thank everybody for coming along and joining us this morning. Big thanks to our panellists. Really appreciate you coming in and giving your insight to what I think was a really interesting discussion, and no doubt we'll have follow-up questions. Apologies to those that we didn't manage to get to this morning, and please, if you email them to me directly, then I'll be able to respond to you or pass on to the relevant panellists to respond. But just remains to say, happy Friday, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your weekend when it comes. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for the opportunity.
John.